Morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us. We're excited to have you here today talking about making accessibility your market advantage. Accessibility is a really critical justice issue in all facets of society and education especially. Today, we are joined by 4 panelists and our organizer, Gabrielle Liu. I'm going to take a moment to go over the discussion, and then we'll introduce everybody. So we'll have a quick opening and introductions. We'll get into the concept of what is accessibility versus usability. We'll sort of dig into more specifics on what vendors really need to know about accessibility, about the current landscape in education, and how that's starting to shape up. We'll get into some questions for the panel. We'll show off a little bit of the Educating All Learners Alliance tech tool library, and we'll close up with some resources. That being said, hi and good morning. I'm Tyler Richendaler. I am product director for the Learner Variability Project at Digital Promise. I've been in education ever since college and worked in it my whole career, been trying to advocate for accessibility for over a decade now. And I'd like to introduce our other panelists. Dr. Amira Abbott, would you like to introduce yourself? And make sure you come off mute.
Sorry about that. Hello, my name is Dr. Amira Abbott. I've been in education for the last 20 years or so. I had a previous career before that. I was a welder, a commercial diver, and then I went back to education. And I also have a learning disability, which is one of the reasons why I really feel this feels important. Thank you.
Mark, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Sure. I'm Mark Angel. I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO at Amira Learning. I've been in edtech for some time. I was previously the Chief Technology Officer at Renaissance Learning.
Thanks so much. Dan?
Hi, everyone. Dan Kogan-Drew, co-founder and Chief Academic Officer at Newsela. Former teacher, also a learner who struggled with reading and was received intervention when I was younger, and the father of a child with dyslexia. So inclusion and accessibility are very much on my mind.
And last but not least, Dr. Teague.
Hello, I'm Dr. Courtney L. Teague. I am I still say that I'm still a special education teacher, although currently I serve at Digital Promise as the Director of Professional Learning, Content and Learner Experience. This topic is also near and dear because I feel that I serve as an advocate for those who may not have a voice or may not have a seat at the table. And so this topic is very, very near and dear to my heart as well.
Once again, thanks so much for joining all of us. And we're excited to have you here and to share your wisdom and expertise with us. So as we get started, something that we wanted to sort of touch on is this concept of accessibility versus usability, because it's in some ways they overlap, some ways they don't. In sort of broad strokes, the concept of usability is a very broad category. It at times includes accessibility. If you're trying to produce and design for usability really well, you're likely thinking about accessibility. But usability itself is born from anthropology, ergonomics, human factors research, and it's typically a focus on the whole user experience and user goals, and how easy or difficult it might be for a user to use a tool, a software, a product to achieve some kind of goal that they might have in mind, or to experience, to have a specific kind of experience, I should say, where accessibility does concern itself with that. But ultimately, it's in the world of sort of government education, things of that nature, it tends to have this focus on disabilities or people who are experiencing an inhibiting factor when they go to use a product or a tool or software. It's often about access up front. Can they even access content? Can they access a tool? hence the name accessibility. And it can partly be about inclusive outcomes, though there's a broader category we'll touch on in a moment about inclusive design, or where it's the concept of an inclusive design takes into account accessibility as a core fundamental part of usability. Accessibility also accounts for assistive technologies, and ultimately is really a big equity and justice issue that is supported by legal standards, but ultimately not necessarily enforced unless, communities, bodies take action to enforce it. Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Dr. Abbott?
Yes, I think of usability more as the design portion of a website or technology, which enhances the usability portion of it for everyone if you use it correctly and have a more universal design. But specifically, usability can help people with disabilities greatly if it's designed ahead of time with accessibility in mind. So I've seen a lot of products where it had to be retrofitted for the accessibility portion, and it affected the usability greatly. But if they don't, they definitely intersect. And with that intersection, you get a more seamless experience for everybody involved if it's done correctly the front end. So accessibility to me is very crucial and important because of that fact. It lends itself to the usability part and experience for everyone. So if you forget that, even though it's mandated by government agencies and stuff, it helps everybody involved if it's done correctly. I can't emphasize that enough. The accessibility portion of the planning, the standards, making things barrier-free, helps everything else along the way and make it a smoother path for everyone involved.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I like to think of the fact that there are products and tools out there that have really strong usability, but aren't necessarily accessible. There's been recent design updates to things like deodorant containers, because people who have gross and fine motor control skills have struggled to opening up an object like that, let alone using a software or technology where the capacity to either read text or experience to engage with the experience in a way that's meaningful for them isn't available to them. And it's a sort of an ongoing problem that has to be, like you're talking about, Dr. Abbott, solved for from the beginning, recentering a population that has often been marginalized. Is there something you wanted to add, Dr. T?
Yes, and even more so to add to accessibility. When we think about accessibility, and thanks, Dr. Abbott, for bringing that to the forefront about putting those with varying abilities in the design process from the very beginning. Because when you think about accessibility means that people can do what they need to do. They can do what they need to do in a similar amount of time in comparison to the person who has a different varying ability. So when we think about accessibility, we do want to bring attention to those with varying abilities, but we want to look at it through also an equitable lens. And I know we'll have conversations around that later on, but we do need to acknowledge those as it relates to accessibility, that they should be able to do the same thing, maybe done differently, but achieve the same goal.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the people I turn to often when thinking about lifelong learning on the inclusive web, which is the name of a paper that Dr. Judith Trevorinas wrote, she talks about that same topic as well, that a person who wants to do something like print a page, if they have accessibility needs, should be able to do that just as quickly as a person who is potentially more able-bodied in a way. And thinking from that point of view is really important, just to have a more holistic, healthy user experience for everyone. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on that, Dr. Evan, Dr. Teague. I'm going to go to the next slide now. And we're going to shift the conversation a little bit. That was a big overview on accessibility and usability, but let's get really specific about what edtech vendors really need to know. And for this, we're going to have Dan Kogan-Drew from Newsela lead us through this. Dan?
Thanks, Tyler. So this is just going to be sort of a quick run through of like some of the nitty gritty of what we're actually talking about so that we can get concrete and specific. But, I find my own history as an educator, I naturally gravitate towards picturing what does this look like in the classroom so that this is not an abstract theory. I think that our panelists are speaking to the equity questions that this is often raising for instructors. And you wouldn't hand out a bunch of textbooks only to find that 2 or 3 kids in your class couldn't actually open the book. You wouldn't be satisfied with that as a teacher. And there's a similar kind of barrier to access that occurs with digital resources. So we go to the next slide and just get specific about what this is. So there's a term that we use internally that's used broadly called WCAG. It stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And these guidelines come from the Worldwide Web Consortium. And basically, they're a set of standards. So when we talk about website accessibility, we're talking about very specific things that you can audit a site for, you can inspect, and you can remediate. And to Dr. Abbott's point, like, we really don't want to be in the position of going back and retrofitting products, but where we have to, and at Newsela we did, we've done that. And so just want to drive home the point of what this looks like for a student who's experiencing one of these barriers, so that we can get concrete about this from their perspective. So we go to the next slide. I mentioned like 2 to 3 students. This is not a small number. This is 13% of the US K-12 student population. Have some form of service for disability. So this is hundreds of thousands of kids, millions of kids out of the roughly 51 million K-12 students in US education. So this is, you can sort of think of this as like, you get the access, you get the device, you get the wireless, you get the subscription to the software, and then you go to use it. And all of that is really for naught because you can't access the content on that piece of software. So why can't you access it? So if we go to the next slide, I'll just run through a couple of examples of what this looks like and feels like. So for those who are visually impaired, one example of where this is a barrier is where there's low contrast. If I have a visual impairment, I might not be able to read the words that are here in gray. They're even hard for those who aren't. And so I don't understand what is the guiding text, first name, last name. What am I supposed to be writing in each one of these fields? Obviously, first name, last name, maybe I could intuit, but does it require that I type my password twice, or is it asking me for my email? And that's just before I've accessed it. This is just as a matter of getting into the product. The next slide. Keyboard traps. This is actually quite common. A student who has a disability, a motor impairment, someone with cerebral palsy, for example, may use a keyboard to navigate. They may not use a mouse. They may not use a trackpad. And there are examples, and if we go to the next slide, of how keyboard traps happen. So you'll have to sort of lean in to see this. I apologize, but you can find this out for yourself going to almost any website and just use the tab key to navigate and the arrows to see how the menus behave. So what this video is showing is what the logic is for where the focus of the control is in any given point within the site. So there's a little square at the top where it says listen, and as the video plays, you'll see this highlight and it goes. If that is not intentionally created, it may not exist, which is completely inaccessible, or it may have some sort of faulty or default logic, which keeps the student from being able to literally access any of the content. They may be able to scroll, but they won't be able to do any sort of navigation. Next example. Form submission issues, just simply understanding when something doesn't work, how does the site explain to you what has not worked and what your corrective action should be. So for example, if you have a screen reader, if the software, the website is not programmed to explain via the screen reader what a field is intended for and what an error message is, they have no opportunity to correct it. They don't know what broke. They just know that they're stuck. Next one. This is maybe a little bit outdated, but you still see this where a student who has difficult, if you can play that video, it'll become immediately apparent. If you have challenge in focusing, any kind of movement on the screen while you're trying to accomplish a task is really not purposeful, is really there, is going to distract you from what you're trying to accomplish. And so this is another sort of impediment to your access. So there's just a few concrete examples. I mentioned that we pride ourselves on being an accessible service, but we found that a couple of years into our existence, we had a very painful interview with a student who had a visual impairment, and we recorded the interview where he was trying to navigate through the site, and he navigated extremely fast because all the text was being read to him, but not everything on our site, by his screen reader, not everything on our site was making any sense as he read it. Some of it was gobbledygook, and some of it he simply couldn't even navigate, couldn't even get from one element on the page to the next. And this was really jarring for our engineering team, our design team, and really the company as a whole. So we took it upon ourselves basically to go back and fix this problem in all the ways that we've just been reviewing. Mark, please jump in if there's anything you would add from a mirror perspective here.
Yeah, a great overview is this. What I found really extremely important in design is the when you get to the body of the text, the read order. If you have different frames or different sections on the page, the read order is crucial in how the information gets displayed and how it gets intaked by the student. I don't know how much you take that in consideration, but the read order imperative, after you tab to get to the right place, if it jumps over to another text frame or something like that, then you're not doing the student any service.
Yeah, the chronology is out of whack.
I'll just chime in a little bit to say that in producing high quality software, test planning and quality assurance process are vital. And what you see in the compliance world is that you need to make adjustments big time. And it starts with the idea that your quality assurance process is going to include users who are going to work with the software through the prism of things like a JAWS reader, and who are going to help you to discover read order and find those keyboard traps. So really coming at this from the point of view of how does your test planning and quality assurance process unfold, we found is critical. The other thing just to add is that we found that the vital difference between getting to true compliance in edtech compared to maybe writing other forms of software is the all-important role of the parent. Many times the motivating factor for districts and educational enterprises is the need to make sure that parents are seeing what they expect around the software. And we're seeing many districts now around the country who have even faced litigation from parents because their children have not been able to access the resources and software that the district has purchased. And seeing the software through the prism, through the eyes of the parent really helps to get to the right place. Yeah.
I just have one more slide just to pick up on Mark's point there. Yeah, so this is from on the legislative landscape. The state of Illinois recently signed, the governor signed into legislation the requirement for what CAG AA would have CAG 2.1 AA compliance to take effect next fall for back to school 2022. And this is sort of an important, this is the first state to have state level legislation mandating this. And we think it's a bellwether to come. And to Mark's point, I mean, the involvement of parents throughout the COVID period has been drastically increased, and there's much greater vigilance and awareness of what students can and cannot use and how. And I think this is large part, this passed unanimously through the legislature. There was no question that this was a priority. So it's coming, and I think the word to vendors is, now's the time.
Now's the time to get ready. Yeah, some of the large districts like Seattle have gotten to the place where you have to have compliance or you just can't bid. And we're even seeing really serious efforts to pass similar legislation in maybe some places that wouldn't be expected, like Texas. So definitely is coming.
and I can speak from digital promises standpoint on the research side of things, is that our, as a nonprofit, the organizations that grant funds to us are increasingly requiring that our platforms, our services, anything that we're researching, be WCAG 2.1 AA accessible, in order to ensure that we are able to bring in the full diversity of learners into the research process, because the outputs and outcomes would be inequitable otherwise. And thank you for sharing this sort of very salient point about what's happening at the government level. The one other idea I was going to put forward was, I think to some extent WCAG 2.1 or any sort of governing standards are a good starting point. But this is ultimately a really big picture design issue. You can retrofit a product and check off all the boxes so that when you have an accessibility evaluation, you show no errors, you meet all of the guidelines, but it doesn't necessarily make for a high quality user experience. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're satisfying and reaching that sort of inclusive design goal of ensuring all users can access the same information, same experiences as easily as everyone else. And so it's just vital to keep in mind that it's not a one-time check off, you check the boxes, but an ongoing effort to always have diverse users in your usability testing, in your design sessions, keeping them centered in this process, because ultimately it's going to lead likely to a better product. And I think, Gabrielle, you had put in the chat this bigger sort of, there's a cartoon or a graphic going around about, I believe it's like a teacher or somebody who's shoveling stairs, and a person in a wheelchair saying, hey, can you shovel the ramp? And they say, well, after I shovel the stairs. And it's like, everybody can use the ramp, build for everybody, like design and retrofit for everybody, like be very mindful of who you're designing for, to ensure that you're being as inclusive as possible. And it's an ongoing process where we're understanding more and more about accessibility every day. Any other thoughts before we move forward?
Yeah, I just want to add, there's a term in the field that goes making a playing field level with assistive technology and adaptive technology. I never really liked that analogy, because from my experiences in the softwares that I've used, and I've taught people for the last 10, 15 years on how to use assistive technology, like the playing field's here, and assistive technology always gets you here, and that gap in between, it's just, you got to work really hard to make up that gap. I mean, there's only so much technology can do. I mean, we're always going to be at a disadvantage if you're a person with disabilities. I mean, if your technology goes out, it's not like I'm personally going to write a hand note that would help me get a project done like a person without a disability would. So we got to keep that in mind. There's always that gap between the so-called normal person, a person without a disability, and a person with a disability that we're always trying to fill. And that's where I think the teachers, special ed education teachers help out a lot to help bridge that gap. So I just want, I guess, industry and designers to know that there's always there to be that little gap there.
Thanks so much for that, Dr. Abbott. So we're going to get into this sort of Q&A portion of this session. And so I'm going to sort of ask some high-level questions and some specific questions to the panel. And I want to start sort of going back to accessibility. We defined it in sort of specific terms. We looked at some specific examples. So when we talk about accessibility and accessible ed tech, how is this showing up for you? What does this look like on your teams? How does this play out more specifically in the education and ed tech spaces? So if there's anybody who wants to sort of kick that off, any initial ideas, feel free to jump in.
I'll unmute and chime in. Sorry about that. Accessibility and ed tech. So I alluded to, the technology bridges a big gap for people who have disabilities, without a doubt, especially in the 21st century with phones and everything that you need to do to be a functioning person in today's society. And having that stuff accessible is crucial in order to function and be a part of society. So I'll tell you a little caveat from my training. I trained this older woman and she had a disability, and I was training her on a software called Kurzweil. And as I was training her, she started tearing up, and I'm looking at her going, oh, did I say something? Did I do something wrong? What's going on? And then all of a sudden she tells me she never really had access to the written word until that program. So how it shapes me is it gives people access to things they normally wouldn't had, and it's a life-changing ability. And that's how ed tech in my world changes things and how I perceive it. It is a life-changing event. And so it's very important that, well, all us people are in this industry, we try to get it right as much as possible. I mean, I understand design and things go wrong, but when we do get it right, it's an amazing feeling. And that's how ed tech and accessibility ed tech affects me.
When I think about just accessibility as a whole, I think about people. Accessibility is people first, then accessibility is people first. It's about being able to identify the needs of each individual, no matter their varying ability, and putting their needs first, but ensuring that they will have an experience that does not place them in a silo or penalize them for having a varying ability. And so accessibility is when anyone, they have access to the information, they have access to activities, no matter their tech use ability, it doesn't matter. They just have access to it. Is barriers are not there. And like, I think about, it's an image that's online that always shows the equality and equity where people are standing behind the fence. I think accessibility is about removing the fence and letting those people come onto that field. It's an old graphic that has been around, that is always used, but it's about removing that barrier and allowing people onto the field and allowing them to demonstrate in a way that they can with the tools that are provided to get the job done. As it relates to accessible ed tech is not the barrier. If we look at back in, I call it the Oregon Trail days, when we used to go into the computer labs and play on the computer, I would say that activity, and no, I'm not showing my age, but that activity was not accessible. It was not accessible ed tech. And the reason it was not accessible because it was not, accessibility wasn't on the forefront. It was not being been included in conversations. So looking at educational technology that has the least amount of barriers in place to allow a person to feel included is what accessible ed tech means to me.
Yeah, that's great. And a lot of times when you're thinking about accessibility in other parts of the software world, you're dealing with concrete impediments such as color blindness that are directly related to the user interface of the software. In EdTech, our mission is to facilitate learning, and often accessibility impediments come in the form of differences in the way that students learn and process information. So in many parts of the world, you wouldn't think about dyslexia as a user impediment to accessing your technology. But hopefully in EdTech, we think a lot about reading disorders, language disorders, other kinds of special issues that students may need to overcome, and ensuring that our technology is really accessible to those students and copes with their special needs and requirements.
And I would also like to add, in addition to the cognitive and physical mobility variations that people may have, thinking about the economic position of your user, thinking about the tech aptitude, those are also indicators and elements that we should also consider. If I'm utilizing a tool, I should be able to see myself within the experience. I should be able to say, hey, this person looks like me. That means it's accessible. This person may have the same experience as me, socioeconomic status. I may read something that is within the tool and I can identify it with it as well. Because these are also considered when we think about cognitive and physical mobility, think about tech aptitude and access. Those are also identity markers. If we want to go down that route, we should also incorporate that into being part of accessible ed tech.
Thanks for sharing that, Courtney. That's something I think we're going to touch on in a minute. Dan, is there a final point you want to put on this part of the conversation?
I mean, plus one. I just that brings to mind so many examples. What Dr. Teague was just describing. I'll just say one is like in the days before Amira, I had an experience with riding a bus in a summer program with a bunch of tablets and a bunch of kids trying to make meaningful use, going to and from their homes and saying, hey, why don't we look up where you live? Let's look up, we're in New Haven, let's find out where your house is. Wouldn't it be cool to see this? 2010, Google Maps, maybe still a little bit novel. And we spent 40 minutes trying to get Google to recognize this girl's voice. And it was the most frustrating thing. And it was because the voice recognition had been modeled on someone who was nothing like this girl, right? The first person to create the technology was not thinking about anyone but themselves, like my voice, my identity, let it first reflect me. Maybe that's a natural bias, but it's a bias. And until you expand the universe, I don't have to speak for Mark, but like until you have until you are literally listening to all your users, you're really being sort of inhuman.
Yeah, and that's thank you for sharing that very salient point. I think it's a great sort of segue into the next slide, which is, so what's Amira and Newsela doing about this? Mark, do you want to kick off since Dan
Sure.
sort of segued into Amira's product?
Dan did a great lead into this, and Amira's really based on the core idea of software being able to listen to students when they're reading out loud. So it's a foundational shift in kind of the user interface that a student experiences. And a big part of the idea is to move from keyboard centricity and the standard input and output mechanisms to a much more natural kind of modality for a student to work with the software, which is a conversational and voice-based modality. So in one dimension, it's kind of core to the Amira idea that we transcend a lot of the limitations of software that was designed with the keyboard and the screen as the central aspect of the interaction. But on the flip side, as Dan mentioned, going to that new user interface introduced a huge set of issues around accessibility. And the mere fact that we didn't have to worry anymore about JAWS readers because everything was voice immediately transitioned into accessibility issues around students who might have speech impairments and students who might have a different dialect or accent or myriad other variations. So for us, it really does boil down to looking at the totality of the user population and understanding the variations in that population that may interfere with their success in working with the software, and then incorporating that variation deeply into our design process, our development process, and our quality assurance process, so that we can, in fact, guarantee that every single group of users is able to experience that Amira listening in an equitable and workable way.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I appreciate the intention of really broadening the lens of who's being included and making sure that you're accounting for that along all the steps. Dan, do you want to talk a little bit about Newsela?
Yeah, I'll just give one example. And I think it's sort of what is the how are you using the technology to do something that wasn't otherwise available? You know, this is what's the new affordance. And so in the example of Newsela, the history of leveled readers, quote unquote, is usually one where students go to the shelf and pick off the purple book or the green book. And there's a couple of factors at work there. One, they're not reading the same text as their neighbor. And two, everyone generally knows that because of the color of the book and the experience of going to get that book, especially if you're below grade level, is socially, if you're not leaving the classroom, you're at least isolating yourself in what you're reading, and the feeling of that can leave you feeling left out. So offering the same text at multiple reading levels is a way of maintaining the affordances of social learning and reminding students that they all belong in the conversation, they all deserve access, keeping the article level not locked so that the teacher at her discretion can choose to do this, but otherwise the student has access to multiple levels of the article. We feel strongly as a way to really recognize student agency and empower students to see that this is not something that's being withheld. It's available to them. Their background knowledge, their interest level can drive them to choose something harder. They can choose something easier as needed as well. And the goal for everyone is to get to the source material on the right pace for them. That's just sort of one example, but it's sort of in our kind of origin mindset, accessibility as like the frame, providing like what Dr. Abbott was saying, that you can achieve accessibility but be unusable effectively. Like everyone might be able to use it, but no one wants to. We have to keep those things in balance.
Yeah, that's a very salient point. It's a great point. From my own personal experience going through grade school and hearing some of my students that are coming from high school into community college, that fear of not being equal or less than because of their education is always at the forefront. Like even accessible keyboards, one-handed keyboards for people, they wanted to look the same and not stick out in class because of their disability. And that's a really crucial point.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I appreciate sort of the attention here to sort of bigger ideas around just sort of cognition and cognitive abilities, and designing very specifically for differences that are less easy to see. Structuring content, thinking about the content, thinking about the language that's used, and how that shows up for the many different learners that are going to be on edtech platforms. I know that we're getting a bit low on time. I want to get to the next two questions. The next one is a little bit broader, but I think we've been touching on it a lot here. Are there any specific points we want to make about the intersection of equity and accessibility and how that shows up in edtech? I think we've hit on it from a few different points of view, but if there's anything specific that Dr. Teague, Dr. Abbott, Mark, Dan, that you might want to add about that, that comes to mind for you or that's coming up in this conversation, would love to hear it.
For me, it's the equity portion of accessibility is making sure the person, the student, has their, I want to say custom, but has their ability to use the equipment as similar as everybody else as best you can. And that's the equality piece, because I made some custom products to make sure the student got what they needed. And that customizability is important for that equity part of accessibility from where I look at it.
I feel that, and I believe that accessibility is the practice of equitable, responsive design. So accessibility, in order for you to have it, you have to be equitable and you have to practice it, which it shows up in the design of whichever tool you may be utilizing.
I want to know Courtney, you're working with a lot of districts through the Verizon Innovative Learning Schools initiative. You're helping with the implementation of a lot of technology. Do you have experience of how this is showing up in the schools that you support in the many districts that your teams work in?
Well, I know that with our professional learning offerings and teacher pathways that we are providing, we are more intentional in our design of content so that when the teachers are participating in our professional learning, we identify and call out the practice, call out the way that we design our learning experience decks so they will see what it looks like, because oftentimes we speak in theory and teachers don't know exactly what it looks like. So if we have something on a slide, we'll say, okay, you may notice that this image looks this way because, so they can have a model. And so what we're finding is that even in our track, our professional learning track that is focused on building accessible, equitable, and inclusive classrooms, teachers are, matter of fact, that track is the one that the most of our schools are taking. They're taking the learnings from us and they're applying and giving us feedback that, oh, I didn't know this, or I didn't think of this. I didn't know that the way I design or the language I use on my slide deck impacts my learner the way that it does. And so we're finding that people are becoming more aware and being more mindful and intentional, such as using colors and using graphics and using images. That's one thing as it relates to design, but also selecting media that reflects their learners. So we're finding that people are becoming more intentional because they have that, we're providing the knowledge, and now they're able to create that awareness. But before, there wasn't much conversation around it because it wasn't on the forefront, or it wasn't the priority. And we're making sure, because we believe within Digital Promise, our equity stance, that we want to ensure that it manifests in all of our practices. So we're seeing more of our schools becoming aware.
I really appreciate that idea of intentionally calling this out, whether it's during teacher onboarding for practices or software, but also potentially I'd be interested to see more specifics on accessibility pages for organizations and softwares, saying we design in this way and we've designed it this way because it's going to better support people. One thing that comes up for me is the concept that we're only ever temporarily abled. It's something that was shared with me a number of years ago, but the bigger idea is there are going to be changes in our context, changes in our lives that are going to affect our capacity to engage in the physical world and the digital world. I was talking with my neighbor the other day, and he found out that he had cataracts and had them removed and was really confused about the world afterward, because he was like, why is everything so blue? Why I'm like able to see stuff, things don't look gray anymore. And he just didn't realize that the slow change over time changed how he was able to see content on the internet, see the world around him. And he was able to have a medical procedure done to help him see better. But at the same time, a lot of the content that he was forced to use was not accessible. And I think just about the fact that even on a day-to-day basis, I haven't slept well. I haven't, for people who are parents, you've got a kid in your arms, you're trying to use a phone, a device, something to better understand, to engage with the world around you, like really understanding the people who are using your product and the different contexts and ways that they're going to need support. The more accessible and more usable the product is, the better it's going to be for everybody across context and across time. Amar, did you want to add something, or Dan or Mark, was there something that was coming up here for you?
Just more culturally responsible instruction, which I think Dr. Teague was referring to, is always good to get the better context for learners to have it ingrained into them and help them be more successful.
And my last thing, I promise you, Tyler, because I know we're short on time, but practicing empathy. In the design, I would like to challenge edtech companies to truly engage in the empathy mapping process and practice empathy for your ideal client. So you can understand what it means to them, what their experience means. What do they see, may not see or hear, but their experience. I would challenge ed tech companies to think about empathy in their design when they think about accessibility, when they think about equity.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to have one last slide here on questions. Any advice or words of wisdom for the ed tech audience? Or for the educator audience? We have people working with schools, in schools. Something that you think is a key takeaway that you just really want to reinforce in the last moments here?
I think just to reinforce the message that the earlier the goal of compliance with accessibility requirements enters into your software development process, the better your software will be and the lower the pain and cost of accomplishing the accessibility goal.
To the educator community, I would challenge educators to be a lifelong learner and understand that each day we are continuously learning. Accessibility is always changing. The definition is always changing. So I challenge educators to be continual learners and advocates.
I would definitely agree on that last sentiment, but to me, it's persistence. All right, never count a student out. You never know where they're going to be if they get the right technology. I mean, just look at Stephen Hawking. Where would we be if it wasn't someone for Stephen Hawking? So mine is just be persistent and don't totally give up on the student, and just keep on keeping on. Just keep trying to get to better, better, and better.
I guess I would just add, maybe it's a little corny, but the Chinese proverb that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago and the second best time is today. If you haven't considered this, now is the best time. And if you have, feel confident you're doing the right thing, but it's never too late. And from a policy perspective, embrace the carrot because the stick is coming.
And I think mine, there's a few ideas. One, I was talking about that paper from Dr. Yuta Treparina, so we'll link it on the resources slide. But she has this very just cogent line, which is stasis is not an option. You can't just sit back and sit still. You have to start taking some kind of action. I don't want to reinforce any sort of characteristics of white supremacy that say you have to do everything yourself right now. I think there's you have the right kind of urgency. This is a justice issue, and making sure that you are bending toward that sort of great arc of justice is a place where you can sort of find the sort of perspective and courage that you need in order to take those steps to engage with communities that you might not have engaged with before, to present humbly and as a partner in relationship in doing this work, because accessibility is a necessity. Otherwise, it will continue to marginalize and remarginalize and to an extent traumatize individuals who have been disregarded for a very, very long time. And I'm really thankful for the work that Mark's team is doing with Amira Learning. Dan, your team has been doing with Newsela and driving this conversation. Dr. Teague, the work that you do with schools every day and making sure that they're implementing technology in a really important and thoughtful way. And then Dr. Abbott, thank you for sharing your experiences and doing your work, helping students at the community college level and beyond really be able to find that passion in learning and find a new love of it to sort of support their life-changing experiences, but also challenging the systems, because I think largely equity is a systems challenge issue. We need to look at the systems that are perpetuating it as much as we need to think about how can I help one person today? How can I challenge a system as well? That being said, I want to sort of jump to the next section in this presentation, which is about the Educating All Learners Alliance Tech Tool Library. For that, we have on this call today, Gabrielle Liu. Gabrielle?
Thank you. And I will be brief, but I did want to jump in and thank all of our speakers for sharing their expertise. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation personally. And just to give you a bit of context, so I'm here representing the Educating All Learners Alliance, which thankfully each member here, each speaker here is involved in, whether directly or indirectly, but we call it ELA, E-A-L-A. ELA was founded at the start of 2020 in response to the shift to remote learning, when we saw that there would be a gap in services provided to students with disabilities. And so we sought out to directly support teachers through resource development and curation. And so we have developed since then a resource library, and now you'll see our tech tool library, all to promote best practices in this space. And of course, as we've transitioned to hybrid learning, in-person learning, we've adapted accordingly. And with our initial audience being mostly educators, we saw now, as you see with this webinar topic, a gap in providing services to vendors. So we're working more to support vendors in that nature. And so with our tech tool library, we recently launched it earlier this year, and it is a library of various edtech tools where one can go to our site, you can navigate to the tech tool page and learn direct accessibility information on some of the most commonly used edtech tools. And so we continue to update this resource library with tools that schools are learning and using. It's not necessarily a recommendation on tools to use, but it is providing that accessibility information on tools that schools use. And so we wanted to offer opportunities for vendors. It's free if you would like to submit your tool to be featured in the library, though we do, of course, require that accessibility information be available to share. And so, yeah, we're excited about this information. As you can see, possibly in the GIF that I provided, it features the tool itself, a description of the tool, as well as some certifications that the tool may or may not qualify for, such as research-based design certification, learner variability certification, the Project Unicorn signatory certification, which is for interoperability. And then we're now featuring a new interoperability signatory certification. And so those are all different features on the page, and we just wanted to share that with you all as we're excited to share that information.
Thanks so much for that, Gabrielle. The library I'm aware of has gotten a ton of use by educators and school districts, and so it's exciting to see that we're able to put these products in one place and be able to show them off. That being said, we wanted to share resources. As Dan had mentioned, the WCAG guidelines, you can find those on the Worldwide Web Consortium website. The Educating All Learners Alliance, the tech tool library is available to you. I had mentioned the Lifelong Learning in the Inclusive Web paper from Dr. Edith Treviranus will provide that. More info from CAST, who works on UDL, and talking about what is accessibility and its difference between accessibility and usability. And we have some other information here about tools you can use, the House Bill in Illinois, and the US Access Board, which is more broadly about accessibility, but pertains to education as well. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being here with us today. And we hope to see you at a future Educating All Learners Alliance webinar in the future. Thanks again to Dan, Mark, Dr. Abbott, Dr. Teague. Really appreciate your time.